Hey, Andy Convery here of Echo Paddles. And if you're anything like me, you'd probably rather spend a lot more time paddling your canoe than maintaining it. But that means your boat ends up looking a lot like this. You can see the gunnels there are kind of graying and chipped and worn, scuffed from where they went on the racks of your car. And just in general, a beautiful canoe ends up looking a little ratty and in need of some love. So I'm going to take you through the process of sanding and re-oiling the woodwork on the canoe so you're ready to go out in the spring. Here's some of the things you're going to need. So we've got from the bottom there, you can see a random orbital sander or a palm sander. That one's great for the top of the gunnels. It saves you a lot of elbow grease, but when you come to the sides and certainly the bottom of the gunnels, you're going to need to go with good old-fashioned hand sanding. So I've got 3 different grits of sandpaper here, a 60 grit, a 120 grit, and a 220. And then there's a little sanding block there. It's a foam pad. You can use that one. Whoop, I like to use the foam pad. You could use a wood block. You can use lots of different things. But these are pretty readily available at hardware stores. It's just a piece of foam. It's got a little bit of squishiness to it, but not too much. And I just wrap the sandpaper around it, and then I can rub out the gunnels with it, and it kind of contours and forms to the gunnel quite nicely, so it works pretty well. The last thing I have here is a scraper. It's a paint scraper. Most people have these at home. They're great for removing the gray areas on the bottom of the gunnel, especially underneath. So when we get this boat flipped over, you'll see that I start using that on the bottom, right where it kind of meets the hull, without scratching the hull itself. So I've got the boat flipped over now, resting on some sawhorses, and I'm ready to start with the bottom of the gunnels, where you can see that's usually where the worst graying and weathering happens, because we keep our canoe stored upside down mostly, and the water pools and things all the dirt gets collected. So I'm going to use the scraper here, and I'm really careful not to scrape into the side of the canoe. I could tape it off, but I've done enough of this that I'm pretty cautious. And what I'm going to be doing is just scraping off the gray until I get back down to much cleaner wood. You can start to see that it's not as gray there. And once I see that it's starting to be a nice brighter ash color wood, then I'll stop and I'll start going at it with the sandpaper. Okay, so I got partway through scraping and it just wasn't working very well. You can get pretty frustrated with these scrapers if, again, you're like me. Your scraper is probably in really rough shape. So I've just taken it to the bench grinder, and you can see that now it's actually got a really nice shiny sharp edge on it, and it's going to make your life a lot easier. So you can do that with a grinder if you have a bench grinder. You could also just do it with a metal file, and just to file that leading edge of your scraper down so that you end up with a nice sharp edge on it is going to really make your life a lot easier, and you're going to do a lot less swearing at your canoe and at me for sending you on this crazy project. Okay, all done on the bottom side. Don't you love how fast that is? I used to love those woodworking shows where they break and, yeah, we just got to cut these 42 rafters now. Done! Oh, look at that. Take me 3 days. Anyway, the beauty of edits. So the gunnels are all scraped on the bottom. This side took me, honestly, it took me probably 20 minutes to do this side. And then I got frustrated there, resharpened the scraper, and did the other side in about 7 minutes. And then came back to this side and redid it with the newly sharpened scraper. And things went a lot more swimmingly. I know, don't use that word, we're paddlers. What you'll find with the scraper, when you're using it, usually I'm pulling it. So you can push it too, but it's really meant to work when you're pulling. But you will find, you can see an area like this here, where the grain, try and zoom in and see if you can see the grain a little more clearly, but the grain sort of changes direction. So if I'm pulling and I'm starting to feel chatter in the scraper, what I'll do is then I'll go the other direction. and you'll feel that it smooths out. Don't look for perfectly smooth gunnels at this point off the scraper. All we're trying to do is remove the gray. We are now going to go to the sanding process once the scraping is done. But the beauty of this, particular scraper is, most people have them, they're pretty readily available, but is that it's a bit of an angle on the blade. You can see that it kind of angles in at the edge, and you can get that right in tight to the canoe without scratching the hull on the side. It's actually just going right into the corner, and it allows you to get that nice clean line. Okay, so both sides are scraped on the bottom. We're going to leave the canoe upside down and go to a sanding with 60 grit. And in this case, I'm not going to use the sanding block. I'm just going to fold the paper in half. I like to use quarter sheets. So this is a full sheet, just folded into quarters, torn, and then I like to fold that in half again, and then start sanding with that folded edge right in tight to the canoe, minding that I'm not sanding the side of the hull, but I'm actually just sanding right in tight to the boat. So I'm going to go ahead and go both sides of the bottom of the gunnels, and even the side here on the front edge with 60 grit on both sides before I move on to a higher grit. Now, didn't that look easy? So I've sanded through 60 grit, 120, and 220. So you may think that the 60 is quite an aggressive, heavy, coarse grit for this, but it's really the only one that's going to get through that gray. I really want to scratch through it and get off that gray. And you could see part of there that I actually went back to the scraper on some of the side walls there, because there were some real stubborn gray parts that just were taking me forever, and I was sweating over it. So I went back and I scraped it off, and then did 60, and then 120, 220. But now you can see the hull is looking all pretty, well, the gunnels, sorry, are looking nice and white ash color compared to what they were before. And those are ready for a final sanding with 320 grit, and then our coat of oil that we're going to get to in a minute. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to flip the canoe over now and work the inside. Good news is that that's the hardest part. The gunnels tend to get more of the graying and wear on the bottom out whale and the outer side. So in the in whales, it's a lot less work. Yay! So I've got the boat flipped over now, upright in a set of cradles. You could also just put them right on the grass, on the ground, between, on two picnic tables, something like that, and work on it. That'll work. So anyway, the boat is now upright, and we can see the difference between where I've sanded and on the out whale there, on the outer part, and the in whales, the top. The good news right now for you is that we can use some power sanding. So on the top of the gunnels, I'm going to take that palm sander and I'm going to work it on top. Ideally, I'm going to take out all of the hardware so I can get sanding nice and tight into all those places, and then just put it back in later. You can work around it if you're feeling a little less ambitious on that, but it's not a big deal to take that stuff out. Now I've got all the seats and yoke and thwarts out of the canoe. I am ready to sand the tops of the gunnels because they're free of all the hardware, and I can just go straight up and down the gunnels, this time using a little bit of power. So I'm going to use the random orbital on this. If you have a palm sander, you can also do this by hand with that sanding block, or even just your hand and the sandpaper. Okay, so that is now sanded to 120 on the random orbital. I could go heavier. I could go with an 80, even a 60. And if the gunnels these ones were in pretty good shape on top. if they were really gray and I needed to go more aggressive, I could actually use a belt sander and have done that up to even like a 50 grit, just to get that material off, and then I can go straight to the 120 on the orbital. From here on, I am now going to go hand sanding with 120, 220, 320.